All right, and we are live. Welcome, everyone, to episode 6 already of Imposter Syndrome. It's kind of insane that this has been going on for half a year already. Today, I have 3 amazing authors here with me to help us dive into the topic of young protagonists and characters within fantasy. And I'm very excited because this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, and I am very sure that these 3 wonderful people are also very passionate about it. So I think we're going to have a good discussion. Palmer, would you be willing to introduce yourself for anyone in the chat who hasn't? Andrew, would you be willing to introduce yourself and give Palmer a second?
Sure, I can do that. So my name is Andrew Meredith, Andrew D. Meredith, and I'm the author of now 4 books. My big epic fantasies, Deathless Collation Saga with Deathless Beast and Bone Shroud. And then the real reason I'm here to talk today is because I have my book Thrice, which is about a man and a boy, and its sequel Fourscored, which came out a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, I forget already.
Those covers.
4/4, so 1 month ago. And that's what I've written. So the Collation Saga is a big epic fantasy, and Thrice, Needle and Leaf, is a Lone Wolf and Cub style narrative in a Slavic fantasy setting.
Awesome. Andy?
Hi, I'm A.R. Witham. This is The Legend of Blackjack. I wrote this. A couple of people liked it. Working on the next one. I wish I had more books. That's it.
I mean, but you wrote a pretty good one to start off with, so I think I think you're golden so far.
All that matters is the next one.
That's right. It better be
Meeting
good,
with
Andy.
a banger is good, though.
Damn right.
True story. Palmer.
Yeah, I'm good now. I was hearing the YouTube echo back at me. So
I've done that before.
Tab, like, oops, let me find it. I have my 32 open tabs. Yeah, so I'm Palmer Pickering. I am a fantasy and science fiction author. I released Heliotrope, which is epic fantasy. I don't know, last November. And then my debut was Moon Deeds, which was 2018, 2019. It was the semifinalist in Spiffle 5. And then its sequel also came out last year, which is Light Fighters.
Sweet.
Yeah. So
nice. I am currently in the middle of the audiobook for Heliotrope, and for anyone in the comments who hasn't pulled the trigger on that one yet, please do. If you like audiobooks and you're interested in some great epic fantasy, it's very good so far. So we've got some people hanging out with us. Hi, Anita.
Tori, what have you written?
Thank you. This is why I am horrible at promoting myself as an author. I'm good at the booktuber host kind of side of things. So I'm Tori, for anybody who doesn't know me and you're just tuning into my channel. And I am a currently published author of YA Fantasy Phased, which is a dark YA about 2 werewolf sisters and the things that they have to overcome to gain freedom. And I have also written way back in the day, in the dark ages of my career. I have also written for middle grade and other YA fantasy. And then I'm also working on an adult fantasy that will have young protagonists in it coming up in November. Is that okay? Awesome.
I like it.
Okay. I'm horrible at that part. I always forget. Thank you. Okay. Yay, I'm glad that you can catch it live. Kaiju is here. Jen says hi. Zin, Elizabeth. And for anybody in the comments who is watching, feel free as we go, if you have any specific questions about what we're talking about or for any of the specific authors, please feel free to drop those in the comments and I will do my best to get to them as we are working through the conversation. Andy's always happy, right, Andy?
As long as anyone's looking. I had a big conversation with my son about that the other day. It was like, there was an article that came out that said, don't tell your kids that you want them to be happy because you're setting themselves up for this impossible goal because happiness isn't a constant thing. So we wound up having this big conversation with my kid. He was like, you don't want me to be happy? I was like, no, wait.
No.
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 Of course not.
Drink, smoke, be evil like me.
Patricia Meredith is in the chat, and she wants to know, Andy, when is the sequel to Blackjack coming out?
Well, if you're eager for more, you can always drop by and grab the Tale of the Border Knight, which will fix
Man,
that.
that's a nice cover.
I wonder who did that.
Who did it?
And
My best friend Sarah did the cover. Sparrow Springs. Yep.
Yeah, and I'm working with her now on some more stuff, a little bit on secret project. So the answer to the question is, Essa Hansen said if she could go back and change anything, she would have done the entire trilogy at once and gotten the entire thing written before she put it out. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm about a little bit more, like 40% of the way through book 2. That goes off to the dev editor by the 500 Memorial Day. So once they're all done, it should be like January 2024, but I'm not locking myself into a date because, you know, you give it to the alpha readers and they're like, hey, it sucks. Okay, gotta fix that.
Are you going to do a rapid release of the 2, or are you going to then space it out so you can prep yourself for your next projects?
I think ideally I'd go like January, March, May.
Oh, there's 3 more books coming out.
Yeah, I'm doing a whole trilogy.
Okay. Is this so is this like a tetralogy, or is this a trilogy that happens after Blackjack?
It happens after Blackjack, but does not require you to read Blackjack to read it.
Nice. So to kind of start the conversation, and I think it's important, and this is going to maybe possibly be the toughest question of the entire episode, because I think when we're discussing things like having young characters and young protagonists in fantasy, and you know, including them in adult fantasy stories particularly, we need to kind of try to define some things, which is going to be very difficult, because if you ask anyone on the internet what their definition of YA fantasy is, it is different every single time. It's
like
kind of like, exactly. It's on both ends of the spectrum. Nobody has a clue what anything is. So with that, in your words, how would you kind of perceive as the main difference between YA specifically and adult fantasy? Palmer?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because with Moon Deeds, I had intentionally did not want it to be slotted as YA. I saw, for me as a writer, I felt there were limitations in YA, and I was like, what is YA anyway? And how do certain books get slotted as YA and others not? And you know, and I looked up the definitions and talked to agents and publishers all over the place. And it was always a different answer. It was like, oh, it's the page count. Oh, it's the age of the protagonist. You know, oh, it's, you know, the length. It's the size of the font. I mean, it was just random all over the place. So anyway, I had written Moon Deeds, and Tor was 13 and Cassidy was 15. And so people immediately thought it was YA, even though it was like 600 pages. Right. So it met one of the criteria for YA, but it totally blew out another one. Right. And I was like, well, I don't want it to be YA. So what I did is I rewrote the whole freaking thing from scratch, like literally didn't even edit, just started over. And I aged them both up to be twins at 20. And I tried to age up their behavior as well. But I don't think I achieved that perfectly, because a lot of people who read Moon Deeds are like, oh, I think it's kind of YA, and Cassie's some really bugs me, you know. So it's like I you can still see vestiges of the younger selves in there. So I think it's a little bit arbitrary, to be honest, and confusing. So there you go.
I would second that for sure. Andy?
I honestly feel like the one requirement, and I'm probably wrong, but I feel like the one requirement is a teenage main character. I think, I was just thinking about it, I was like, that's the only drumbeat I can come up with that's consistent through everything, because you've got dark, you've got light, you've got humorous, you've got, you know, all kinds of different things that go into that style. And I think you've got a teenage hero, for lack of a better term, it almost doesn't matter what kind of situation you put them in or what kind of story it is. It kind of fits in a YA slot. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's written for them. That's a different story. But I feel like of the stories that are out there, take the marketing and the positioning aside, I feel like that's the only thing that I can find as a consistent truth.
So does that mean if the main character is a teenager that it's always YA and it can't be adult?
No, I think that it can be perceived as YA, right?
Yeah.
Because like with horror, you can take Firestarter, right? Is Firestarter a YA book? Well, no, it's a horror book. Well, it has a young female protagonist. Okay, that would fit into YA, except for that it's horror. So
does Scream, right?
Right.
They're in high school, but it's meant for anybody from PG-13 up. I mean, anybody can watch it. Yeah. I think for the three of us, probably sans Tori, we are of an older generation who grew up reading fantasy in the 80s and the 90s, right? Which was pre-Harry Potter and was here's what a YA is. So all of our fantasy had YAs mixed in. Or what? Not YAs. Had young protagonists mixed in that aged up. And whether they aged up in your mind probably had to do with the age you were when you read them, right? So like when I read the Bulgariad, he's 12. He never gets past 12. It doesn't act like he's any older than 12 by the end of the first book, but he's 20, I think, by the end of the first book. But in my mind, as a 12-year-old who read it, he never got past 12. And you could say the same with Fitz, right? It's like I'm coming back now as a 40-year-old reading it and realizing that Fitz does age up really well. Like she writes his age improvement between the books, and whereas as a 19-year-old, he was a 19-year-old, and then he's still a pubescent 19-year-old, and then he's still a immature 19-year-old, no matter what book you're reading. Because I was 19 when I read it, so I mean, yes, you need to have a young protagonist to be YA for the fact that it then relates to the reader, but we're also in a position where we can kind of straddle that, right? Because we existed in an era where there were young protagonists in a lot of our fantasy, but it was meant for adults too.
Right. Eye of the World.
Well, I was thinking about that too, because the two major series that are very widely read and beloved within the community would be that have young protagonists, at least in the beginning, or if not in the whole series, are Realm of the Elderlings, obviously with Fitz, and then you have A Song of Ice and Fire. If you look at the age of a lot of the main POV characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, a lot of them are very young. I'm thinking of Arya. Arya is a very young character in a world that is incredibly grimdark.
All the Stark kids.
Yeah,
all the Stark kids. Right.
The Stark kids. That's what they are at the beginning.
And like nobody blinks an eye at that. It's just part of the world. And I think maybe to me, what sometimes I think can happen is if the world really kind of spins around the axis of this young protagonist, then I think it sometimes is easier to categorize it into that kind of YA sphere, as opposed to like in A Song of Ice and Fire, obviously they're not like the world is, there's no axis. But I don't know if that makes sense either, because I had the same thing with Phase, because I have two 16 and 17-year-old sisters in Phase. And I kind of, people called it YA, and I kind of like categorized it that way just to have something to put it under for a category. But Phase does not, it's very dark. It's very dark YA. So I'm still dealing with a lot of grown-up issues, I guess, within it. And so it's a very weird, like when you're trying to explain it to people, I almost feel like I have to make a disclaimer, like it's YA, but it's still like it's not, and I think YA and also romance have kind of become kind of tangled as well, which
and erotica,
right?
It's erotica for teenagers. Enjoy.
We're not talking about Sarah J. Maas today, though.
No, please.
I think a lot of it has to do with the traditional publishing operations constraints that, to be honest, indie authors don't have to worry about it. Like when I had the same discussion about fantasy versus science fiction versus space opera. Like the traditional publishers need to give it us a definition to tell the booksellers what shelf to put it on, literally what physical shelf. And you've got your BISAC numbers. I don't know if you guys put BISAC numbers on your copyright page, but you have to pick one. And like science fantasy doesn't exist, for example. I'm not so young adult. I'm not sure if it does, but probably it must. But you also have other marketing motions that traditional publishers use. How they market. They market specifically to YA audiences, but indie publishers are kind of like, we can do what we want. So does it even matter? I don't know. Like, how do you define yourself as a YA? Like, what does it bring you? Like where you end up in Amazon? Oops, Tori left.
I'm in charge now.
Oh no. Oh no, the slave master, the mean guy.
All right, we've ditched the host, so we can tell you about the Kickstarter that we're starting for Tori. We're going to raise $19,000 for her next work so she can make sure that she's got all of her editing handled, distribution, and can market it as YA, which is impossible.
Please make it out to cash. We're going to Brazil. Just to visit Thiago. That's all. I would say
Daenerys is like, what? Is she 16 or something? 17?
Yeah, I think so.
I think she may be even younger.
You're back. We talked about you for a second. Andy had a very secret thing you're not allowed to hear.
We'll go back and look at it.
Yeah. And I was saying Daenerys, Jon Snow was 14. Daenerys is like 15, 16, right? But they started with the scene of the incest scene in a tower, right? With adults. So you're like, oh, this
and Joffrey during the whole series, which still hasn't ended, never gets older than the 13 he starts as maturity wise.
And you want to kill him regardless.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that complicates the whole matter is I've been thinking about the comparison of literature to like Hollywood, right? And Hollywood has PG-13.
Yes.
And PG-13 does not mean YA.
Right.
It means that it is not just for those over the age of 17 or 18, right, for rated R. So it is, I mean, like Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones is not YA. It's not adult either. It's for everybody, right? But in order for us to ensure something's adult, we got to throw in a scene that we would never have a 12-year-old read in order to get it to be adult. It's like, we don't have to do that. Like Palmer said, we get to do whatever we want in indie. And that means we can write something that has a young protagonist, but is meant for all ages. Like for me, I feel like YA is, can a bookseller hand it to a teen and mom will roll her eyes and still put it on the counter and buy it? Versus something that's adult, a bookseller can hand it to a teen and dad might go, oh, I want to read that when you're done. Right. And then now it's not YA, but it's general audience at that point, because that particular teen can read older than the average.
I mean, epic
YA
fantasy
reader
kind of covers that whole span, right? But paranormal seems to get slotted into YA a lot. Just the word paranormal.
Yes.
Have you noticed?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, and in fairness, I wrote Phased initially. My initial catalyst for wanting to write it was as a response to so many of the things that I was tired of seeing in YA paranormal. And then it just kind of became its own thing. And yeah, I mean, I feel like there's the other thing I made a note of when I was looking at the questions again before this was that, like you said, Andrew, with how things have changed between the 80s and 90s fantasy versus now, is those lines seem to have blurred very heavily in terms of crossing genres, and also, who can read what in terms of age levels and I mean, there's a subcategory for everything now. Which I think
the level of adult content that's in YA now.
Exactly. Like we went from Harry Potter being YA to Six of Crows being YA, and Six of Crows is one of my favorite like YA fantasy books.
Amen, sister.
But it's not YA. I remember reading that and being like, wow, okay, so the difference between YA and like adult rated fantasy is what? Exactly. right? Like, so I remember thinking, like, just the lines seem to have blurred so much, which I think it's got to be really hard for people who are looking for legitimately YA content in fantasy to find things that are age appropriate for, like, that we would hand to a teenager, because just having a YA label is not necessarily safe anymore.
Right.
Yeah, I like the age ratings that you can put in I think in Amazon, right?
Yeah.
You know, similar to movies, like you were saying, Andrew. I think that makes more sense. It's like, should you let your child read this, or should you not? Like, how gnarly does it get, right? And how old is your kid? Like, if your kid is 14, you know, maybe there's some stuff you don't want them to read.
And, you know, there's a whole, I've seen debates online where like, well, we shouldn't be telling them what not to watch, what not to read. And it's like, but if I'm at a convention and a dad and a son walk up, what's my easiest sell? Like, we're in this to sell books, right? And me going, hey kid, don't tell your dad you bought this, but no, I'm going to talk to the dad and go and to the kid too. And if the dad loses interest, I can sell it to the kid, sell it to the dad. Maybe he'll buy it. Maybe it goes in the library. The best books are the ones that are discovered on your dad's shelf, right? Well, not all of them, but you know what I mean? And so who are you trying to sell to? And yes, how do I sell dad on it? How do I sell I can, you know, a particular mom or dad walks up and I'm like, this is going to be a tough sell, but I can sell this to them versus I don't want to ignore them. I want to have a book that I can sell to any person that walks up, not go, well, I'm not going to sell to them, because you don't sell books that way.
But so I don't have that perspective. I write the books because I like to write, and hopefully people like to read them. But for example, Light Fighters has heavy duty trigger warning content, and I am scared of that. I'm scared that I put that out there and the response that it could elicit in people. And I actively tell my friends, like, very strongly, don't give that to your kid. Your kid's 12. Like, really? I'm like, yeah, read it and then you decide.
Yeah.
But you know, I mean,
it's about being responsible for not just ourselves, but for our friends too.
Yeah, but I struggled with how to write at the beginning. The first line of my like Amazon blurb or my Goodreads blurb was trigger warning for blah blah blah, and a friend of mine was like, "Take that down. You're never going to sell any books with that." And then I was like, "Well, okay, now like, well, how does George R.R. Martin handle it? He doesn't have any trigger warnings in his content." I looked at Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, which has some similar level content. There's a lot of discussion about it, but the blurb doesn't have like, "Hey, watch out! It has this kind of disturbing content in it." Doesn't say that.
I think that also can come down to what your friends tell you about, right? Like Tori knows what are my triggers, and if I'll say I'm going to start with this book, and she goes, just so you know, it's got a torture scene in it, I'll be like, how bad is it? She goes, it's pretty bad. I'm like, okay, cool. I get to push that down the TBRR off because I'm not doing that, and that's what friends are for, right? Is that we can be the trigger warnings when we know it's sensitive, as opposed to having to read through a large thing of trigger warnings.
Well, and that goes kind of into the idea that there's a two-way street here, right? We have the author and we have the reader, and that both have, you know, their own versions of the responsibility over the book. And that I think we can't take one or the other out. You know, like as a reader, it's important for me to, like, same with Andrew, listen to what people are saying about a book to know, okay, if this book has like an insane amount of gaslighting in it, I'm going to have a hard time with it. So I just have to know that going into it. But I don't necessarily go, man, the author should have, you know, warned me about that. Because I always try to, you know, look into the books that I'm going to read before I read them. There's been some good, let's see. Andy might be able to answer that.
Yeah. And, you know, if you look at both, technically that's a YA character. Technically, it's a YA book. I mean, you've got a character who starts out as a really young kid, matures to his teenage years, goes to magical wizarding school, has relationships with his teachers, doesn't know how to approach a relationship with a girl. All the things are there, right? But the prose takes it out of YA as just that category,
right?
And puts it into, you know, okay, more general fantasy.
Yeah.
And I'm with Palmer. I feel like the categories exist so that you can figure out something, right? Because in ye olden days, it used to be. I remember back when it used to be sci-fi / fantasy. That was like the category, right, at the bottom of the book. That was it, right? And so everything fit into that. And but trying to categorize things in some kind of way makes sense. Although I honestly do feel like at the end it's a futile effort, because a fantasy book, an epic fantasy book, is not like another epic fantasy book, right? It's maybe got some similar notes in it. Oh, they're playing a xylophone over here. Okay, cool. This is like a xylophone book. But it's not. They're not all playing the same tune. So you got to divide things up a little bit, and name a better way to do it. Right? It's like, okay, now you categorize everything. It's your Dewey Decimal System now.
It's part of the funnel, right? That's just the beginning of the funnel.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it's where you look on Amazon to the subcategories to see where your book ranks.
But only for the first 50. You can't see past the first 50.
Because Amazon.
It tells me that I'm like 6,422.
Yeah.
I
That's a good rank if you're 6,000.
I would like to posit something to everybody. And I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure if it's true or not. So stick some knives in this if you can. Or agree with it, whatever you like. But I was thinking about one of the other differences between YA and not YA is that the stories about characters, lots of people like, this guy's really experienced and he's really good with a sword. And this girl is an amazing wizard and she knows all these things and she can do all this. It's kind of that aspirational book where it's like, oh yeah, I want to be that, right? I got my normal life. I want to be that guy. I want to be a master ninja. Okay, here we go. And then on the other side, you've got characters who are completely unprepared. And I feel like that's probably another defining factor in YA-ish things, because the stories are different because you're taking somebody who has a reason that they're not skilled or proficient or anything useful to anybody, including themselves, and throw them in a meat grinder. And okay, how do they react? What does this look like? And so to me, a lot of it feels like the difference between characters who are prepared and characters who are not. And the characters who are prepared kind of take me out and give me that, oh, now I'm riding on a horse. I'm a master knight, whatever I am. Mm-hmm. Whereas the YA and the unprepared stuff makes me go, how do you figure this out? The world is too big. The problems are too big. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I feel like that's where the why happens. Any feelings there?
Yeah, and then you've got the older the older retired warrior thing, like Telio and Heliotrope, where they've gone through the training, they've been at their prime, and now they're kind of in redemption mode, like trying to make amends for all the crap they did when they were younger and all the mistakes they made, right? So it's almost sort of regretish or mentoring the younger generation. And I totally agree with you. Like the young protagonist, whether it's in adult fantasy or young adult, like what characterizes a believable younger character is they're trying to figure out who they are. They're trying to gain skills, right? Whether they're in some training program or this through trial and error, or they're just thrust onto the alleyways of London, when they're 5 and they have to figure it out.
Yeah.
But there seem to be some tropes that are similar for all young protagonists, right? In fantasy, like they discover that they have royal blood, and I've used these tropes, like or they have some special powers, or there's some genetic lineage, or they're being manipulated by the older characters, so those seem to be standard kind of things that the younger protagonist has. I don't know if you agree or not.
I was going to say, Andrew,
just cued me. I was already thinking of how I was going to say it.
I was just about to ask this.
So KM Weiland, her blog is helping writers become authors.com. And her book just came out. I was hoping it was going to arrive by today, but I don't have it. But she just wrote her book that was based on her 6-month study of character arcs, which is like the culmination of her 17 years of blogging she's done, and kind of putting it all together well. And quick overview is that you have 6 arcs through life of the maiden, the hero, the queen, the king, the crone, the mage, and they're masculine, feminine, but it mostly has to do with the type of story arc they're telling. The three feminines are about the discovery of self and trying to balance your masculine and feminine side, which are what you believe what you mean to be and what society tells you to be, and then marrying the two to become a whole, right? Whereas the hero, the male arcs of the hero, the king, the wizard are about defeating the dragon. And I would wonder, and anyway, so she talks about how the first 2 arcs, the maiden and the hero, are the ones we're most familiar with. It's, Pride and Prejudice is a you better get married. And she says, I'm not going to get married, but on my own terms. And so that's the end, right? It's the story of Little Red Riding Hood, right? Whereas the hero is the stereotypical hero's arc, and most of the stories we read are in those because they're more familiar with them. And plus, most people die by the time they get to crone and mage status. So and America's afraid of death too. So we never want to face the death arcs that happen late in life. But that being said, Andy, I think it matches into that. Someone who's trying to do the youth who's discovering themselves is the youth who's following that maiden's arc. Mm-hmm. And the youth that is just out for the adventure. I'm the best. My name's Ray Palpatine, and I'm awesome. She's going through a hero's arc of she's going to kill the dragon. And she doesn't need to have as much of she's still going to learn things and has to bring back the elixir, but she doesn't have the discovery of self that the maiden's arc does. Mm. But they're all kind of populated with the same sort of characters because they're populated by their shadows, and rarely and the mentors that all appear, the Dumbledores, are all the mages who have made it to the other arcs and are, like you say, Palmer, feeding back to the younger generation to hand off the gauntlet. So
mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Like, in the way you put it as well, is a female could be on the hero's arc.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Because we all go through those. We all go through those statuses ourself of hitting our teenage years into saying, who am I? To the point where we hit 20, like, well, what am I going to do now? What do I do? And then as you go into the queen's arc is when you are basically, your kids are growing up and you have to start treating them not as kids, but as subjects, as your subjects, as you enter a king mode, so on and so forth. So she's very explicit about the fact that each set of arcs has nothing to do with whether you yourself are male and female. They're just easy to identify. But like, I forget, she had a really good example of like male's maiden arc is like, it's a Tobey Maguire movie, but I can't think of which one it is right now. But fascinating read. It changed my life on how to write arcs after reading those blogs.
Definitely post somewhere what the book is. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I can maybe send you the link too on Discord afterwards, Palmer.
Okay, cool.
There's some good. This is Elizabeth. I think this is a really interesting comment because I think this is, for me, what it has always come down to is it's hard to articulate. Like, there's that feel of, this feels YA, but it's hard to articulate why. And I think, I think the comments that, Andy was making about the kind of a character it's like a coming of age. Almost that discovery of self is typically what we see in a lot of the YA stories. Not that there can't be one of those in adult fantasy, but typically it's either you're aging the character through a longer period of time, or they are surrounded by other ages of characters or situations as well.
Well, look at both Smallville and Wednesday, which are both by Gowan Miller, who wrote them. And Smallville is him trying to he's not on a hero's arc until like 10th season because it was too many seasons. But Clark is trying to discover the self of being both Clark and Superman. And in Wednesday, she's trying to discover the self of being her own to be Wednesday and to be an Adams. What does that mean to be both? And so she marries her masculine and feminine, and it usually comes through I'm going to stop trying to be who I'm supposed to be and give in to what society tells me, and you fail, and then have to fall back to your original, and then realize the only way to win is by being both, and that goes for both Wednesday and Clark. So,
yeah, Sorry about that. My children brought me a flower and put it on my nightstand, and then my kitten
Nice.
started eating it.
Oh,
So,
one that wasn't belladonna.
No. Yeah, and this is something that, you know, with all of us being indie authors, I think it's very interesting too, because there's so much genre bending going on in indie fantasy, which is exciting because it means that we're trying new things and we're pushing the boundaries of what fantasy looks like, which is exciting, but it can be sometimes then harder to put it into a recognizable category for readers. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be doing it. Let's see. Trisha, I think the key is making sure it meets reader expectations. How do you tell the reader with the cover and back of the book, 50 pages, that this book can be read by all ages? That's a good question, Jen, because I'm actually dealing with this right now. I have a duology not published, but the first book does seem like a YA, and the second book does not because the protagonist grew up some. How do you deal with a young protagonist that grows up? From my personal experience with Phased, so the second book in the duology, True Blood, it takes place about 3 to 4 years after the end of Phased. And so now I'm dealing with 2021, which is a big leap from 16-17. And I'm kind of with Palmer, because Palmer, you mentioned at the beginning, we just kind of write the book, right? And then we're like, so categories. I kind of feel that with Phased and True Blood, where that's the story that I'm telling. And like, whether it fits into categories or not, that's the story I'm telling. And the characters, I would hope that, you know, Phased is dark enough that I feel like if somebody can handle Phased, they'll be fine with book 2. But I do tend to tell people, like, it is dark YA. So I do sell it that way when people ask me about, is it YA? And I'm like, I mean, technically, but it is dark, you know, and here's some of the themes if they ask about it. But I would just encourage you to write your story, to be honest, because I think we can get so caught up in, well, is this book going to fit in a certain box? And that can be a choke point for us sometimes. Do you guys have thoughts about that?
Jen was commenting, I can't find it now. Did you delete it? About how it's, as an indie author, like, how do you basically slotting something in a genre or subgenre? I'm paraphrasing and making assumptions about what you're saying, but it helps readers find your book.
Yes.
And that sort of identifies the problem as an indie reader. How do you find readers? I mean, an indie author, how do you find readers? How do people learn about your book, find out about your book? To me, like, the category is not helping. I mean, Barnes and Nobles is not shelving my book, so they're not helping me. I'm not hitting the top of Amazon, so that's not helping me. So what's helping me is stuff like this, relationships, communities. I think, just to go off on a total, you could have maybe you've already had ToriTalks on this topic, but the indie community is giving the trad publishing industry a run for its money. It's because of stuff like this. It's this community we're all in Discord and Twitter and Spiffbo, that is where you see the humanity of the authors. You get to talk to the authors. Authors get to share information. We promote each other's stuff. People who are avid fans find the community and find really good work. And there's a lot of crossover with people's TBR stacks between trad and indie. And honestly, some of the traditionally published stuff I've been reading lately is, I'm not super excited about it. I've DNF'd a bunch of stuff. I'm like, really? Like, this is so predictable. Like, yawner.
Well, it's funny because I remember talking to an author recently who had queried some agents for traditional publishing, and it was almost coming to the point where the publisher would say, here's what we are going to publish. This is the general outline of the book we want to publish. You show us how your book can be fit into this thing that we want to publish, and we'll let you know if we pick yours. And they have a group of authors that are all vying for this same box, essentially. And
Wow.
that just totally blew my mind because I cannot ever
Whoa.
imagine.
So talk about formulaic.
Right. So that I think that's one of the problems is it's not the authors. It's the fact that I think a lot of the companies have kind of boxed them in and said, nope, we're not going to publish you if you're outside of this trend or this, thing.
They know what they can sell.
It's like
Exactly.
the
Right? We
Marvel
have built audiences for these things. We know
Right.
how to sell books to these
Right.
audiences. Of
And-
course, we're going to make product
Mhm.
for those audiences.
And that's one of the reasons why, we're seeing all these remakes of the same things that have been redone in film and television over and over and over. And we're like, where's the new stuff? And I think it's because they're like, well, but this sells.
Mhm.
We know that if we put the name Lord of the Rings or Twilight on something, that it's going to catch a group of readers. And like I don't have the regular edition anymore, but one of my favorite series of all time is Red Rising. And I've had the conversation with people before about how it constantly gets equated to the Hunger Games, which to me is the difference between YA and adult right there. But on the cover of the original version of Red Rising, it says something about for fans of the Hunger Games or something like that on the cover. And to me, that was a marketing ploy. And
Yeah.
Andrew, I think you were the one that brought that up when we were talking about it the first time, that they were trying to catch that crowd. And it's actually done a disservice now to what Red Rising is as its own story.
Well, I remember when I worked at a bookstore selling Harry Dresden as Harry Potter for adults, and the farther I get away from 2010, the more I think that was an incorrect assumption. It's like, are you still a reader of fantasy and adults, but you liked Harry Potter? Okay, well, have you tried Harry Dresden? A better example would be to try to sell them Jonathan Strange, but the vast majority of people are not going to jump into that tome unless they're a very heavy reader, not necessarily a
dabbler.
Read a lot of books. That's why you read Harry Dresden, right?
So what genre is Red Rising?
To me, it's adult sci fantasy. Like there's a young protagonist, like Darrow in the very beginning is 16, which a lot of people, he doesn't necessarily read 16 through the whole book. But it's very heavy content wise, as far as it's not something I would ever hand to a 14, 15, 16-year-old.
But the themes are
much heavier. There's a lot more kind of graphic detail, that sort of thing. Whereas in Hunger Games, the stakes can be very similar, I think. You're still dealing with the threat of, we could die, or we could, whatever the big stakes are the same. It's more, I think, how they are presented and in what level of detail sometimes. Yeah.
I think it also ties back to the same complaint we have with Amazon, right? Of that, it keeps suggesting more of the same. Because it works, because the vast majority of readers want more of more, not more of similar. They want more of more. And so pitching Red Rising as just like Hunger Games, right? Just like Hunger Games, right? Well, no, but if you grew up reading Hunger Games, it might appeal to you because this is a more adult book. And also we want you to buy it because you like Hunger Games, right? And so they're trying to recapture the same audience over and over and over and over again, like Amazon does. But that's the vast majority of the common reader, who's more than happy to pick up another Sarah J. Maas book, even if it's the same plot every single time, or even Harry Dresden. It's going to be a wizard. He's going to talk to a skull, and it's going to have to fight something bigger than last time. You ready? Boom, let's go. And it works because it sells millions of copies.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you need some kind of shorthand, right? You can't get into a half-hour discussion on every book that you want to read. You need it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Okay, cool. I mean, that's how we used to pitch movies. Is you would just go take a movie and another movie, and you put the two of them together, and that's the pitch. And they go, "Oh, I like that. Oh, I don't like that."
Well, like summer blockbusters, right? There's a summer blockbuster. It's a formula. Right, compared to you can't have every movie be a rival. We can't have a Christopher Nolan movie every single year. When it comes out, we're going to be getting something that's going to be literature, and we're going to get to enjoy it. But we can't have everything be Villeneuve, because we don't want it to be. We want Villeneuve to be Villeneuve. Can we just leave it at that? And we're still going to go to the summer blockbusters. All of us are.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not anymore. We're watching at home, but that's the point of the summer blockbuster, is that Will Smith is going to sell a movie. So
well, not anymore.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Palmer.
10 years ago.
I mean, there's something comforting in knowing what you're going to get and having, the familiar heartstrings or adrenaline rush coming. You know what you're going to get, like Lee Child's kind of stuff, or 007 or whatever it is, where you know what you're getting. I think for a lot of hardcore epic fantasy readers, though, they tend to be a much more kind of nerdy, well-read type that is more demanding. So, if I'm going for that audience, then I'm trying to write good literature. And the people who are like, oh, fantasy's not literature. It's, it's like, really? But so if you want to create kind of a masterpiece, you kind of go for the epic fantasy audience, right? But if you want to sell a lot of books, then, you write a more formulaic,
something that they can easily slip into and follow because it's familiar. Yeah.
And then there's other times where we take a formula and we say, yeah, but can I lean into the formula and do it in my way that makes people think fondly back to something they've read before, a la Blackjack, but also in a way that surprises everybody, I've noticed both in your work, Andy, and in JCM's, is there's been times where there's a trope that's dropped, and I'm like, oh, here we go. This is going to be I'm going to have hard time swallowing this pill, because here comes that trope, and then you don't do it. And I'm like, thank you. You've all been complaining about the trope for so long, and you just said, oh, so I could do this thing, and you literally, your characters say, I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to do the thing. No, I'm not. And I'm like, thank you. That's all I've been asking for 25 years.
I really like things to be unexpected, and surprising. And
what else are you gonna do?
Yeah,
I mean, come on, you can't write the standard fantasy novel. The boy's on the farm and he gets a sword, and the night comes and they go and they fight the dragon, and you can't do that. They've done that story a million times. You got to break things. Now, I personally don't like deconstructionism for the sake of deconstructionism.
Right.
I feel like a lot of people will bend things because they're like, well, I want to mess with that. Like Abercrombie does it for the sake of doing it, and it works out great. But most of the time I'm like, you're just trying to yank me around here and give me something other than what I was expecting. But if you're writing a story and you don't provide surprises for the reader, what are you doing? You got to be taken by surprise. That's just basic storytelling.
Yeah, exactly.
It's talking quality, and you're not talking about churning out the same old movie year after year after year.
And this was a question that I really wanted to get to, because I think within
that's the one that that's the one I'm pointing at.
Yep, I figured.
Absolutely true. Because what they did, there have been so many D&D movies, and they're all terrible. And they approached it with humor. My God, what a concept. Because this is what everybody does when they're sitting around the D&D tables. They make each other laugh with a bunch of stupid stuff. That's half the fun of the thing.
Right.
And so having somebody come in and go, you know what, I'm going to write a story where we screw around. There's not, it's a big bad guy that's going to kill everybody. Whatever. We got a fat dragon. Okay, we're going fat dragon.
That was a cute dragon.
It was wonderful.
So with kind of leading into the next question I had on the list, because why is it important for us to include young perspectives in fantasy?
We've all been there. We've all been young. I don't know. It's relatable. It's a journey. It's the beginning of a journey.
I feel like it goes back to the prepared versus unprepared thing. There's a big piece of me that believes that there's a lot of lost and lonely going on, and it doesn't matter if you're 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. Sometimes it helps to watch somebody figure it out. and wend their way there. And yes, that's appropriate for teenage readers, but it's also appropriate for a lot of other audiences. And, you know, if you're at the wizard stage of your arc or the crone stage of your arc, you're probably not going to really have a lot of that left to tap into. But I feel like up until, you know, those last two arcs, I feel like everybody's got questions and they're looking for answers, and we get better at either figuring out what the answers are or pretending like we do. And sometimes watching a young adult who you aren't mad at them, they don't know anything, right? They're not supposed to know anything. They're supposed to be bad at this because they don't have any experience whatsoever. They have no proficiency. And you can identify, like Palmer said, because we've all been through it, but it also, as an adult, it kind of gives you a sense of hope and a sense of direction and a sense of, yeah, okay, this is an obstacle, and I'm with them on that. That's a big obstacle, and I don't like that. Oh, this is how they went about solving. Okay, that's interesting. You don't always necessarily apply it to your life, but I feel like that's an emotional need that plenty of adults have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like to your point on hope too, is that when you have multiple characters of different age groups too, you can kind of tack that hope. Like Dean Koontz would be a good example of that, right? Unlike Stephen King, if there's a dog or a kid, they will survive. Now everybody else is off the table.
Screw them.
But the kid and the dog will survive if introduced into a Dean Koontz novel. So there's a set hope that you're like, it's going to get bad. It's going to get really bad. Maybe even for the kid and the dog. But the kid and the dog live. And you're like, okay, I can handle all this other awful that's going to happen. Knowing that Baldur is going to survive Ragnarok, right? And that's the hope of Ragnarok, is that you've got Baldur who's going to survive and restart the world with everybody that survives Ragnarok. And so we can do that too. And especially if we're writing a big epic with multi-point of views, is having different age groups also kind of almost telegraphs who you can get people to be attached to, right? Is that if you have a young protagonist and a really old protagonist, they may love the wizard, but they also could hate the old dude and really tack onto the younger character, especially if, say, the older. I'm not going to say that. That's a spoiler thing. Sorry, Tori. All right, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say too, like, and I would say this is true for, you know, Palmer in Heliotrope and also Andrew in Thrice. Watching the older characters interact with the younger characters is part of what makes those older characters nuanced and endearing, right? Because we're getting to see the older characters who've oftentimes been really jaded by the things that they've experienced, and they're kind of the rough veterans at this point, and then they come face to face with something they've kind of forgotten, like, or they've lost touch with, and it's that youthful naivety and kind of maybe hope that the older characters have forgotten how to, you know, latch on to. And I think that's something in fantasy that I've always really loved is that sense, like you said, Andrew, of no matter how bad it gets, there's always that something, that thread of some kind of hope that you can pull or that overcoming that you can pull yourself to the end with. And that oftentimes I think comes from, or is at least sparked by, the younger characters in the story.
The flip side can be true though too, right? When you push a kid out of a tower in the first 10 pages to his supposed death, just having his legs broken, you now know, by the way, nothing's on the table.
Right. And
Nobody's
also
safe.
all of your readers absolutely hate that character forever now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's always a nuance to it too, but you're setting that first 50 page expectation of how are you going to treat little kids, and how are you going to treat everybody else? Like the preview for that new movie Sifu. Is that what it's called? Sisu. That's it's like John Wick, but it shows a really cute dog, and they're like, shoot the dog, and all of the tags are, the dog survives the movie. It's okay, the dog's gonna live. Nobody else is safe. The dog's gonna be okay. And like, okay, and everybody wants to go see the movie just to see how awful the rest of it's gonna be, knowing the dog's gonna make it.
The dog's gonna be okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, George R.R. Martin was kind of got his reputation for flipping everything on its head and shocking the reader and doing the inverse of what was, you know, quote unquote okay, and killing all of his main characters and all this stuff, incest, like all this stuff that's like taboo, and writing it so well that you're just engrossed. He kind of broke some barriers, I think. Like where Lord of the Rings didn't really break any barriers. I mean, it was just all very mythological, legend, elves, and then George R. R. Martin was like, okay, this is reality.
In that tone of voice too, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's true how, like, I've been doing a little bit of study into the definitions of like clean fantasy and grimdark and like all of these different tags that we put on things, and it's just so interesting to me to see also how every single reader has a different boundary of what is okay and what is like acceptable behavior, or what, I mean, all of us have different life experiences and expectations that change where those boundaries are going to land for any specific book.
Yeah. What's Noble Bright? That's a new one.
That's like the opposite of grimdark. Yeah, the complete opposite. Yeah.
Like everything's happy. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. So like grim versus noble is the aesthetic of whether everything's covered in crap versus something really, really shiny. Okay. And then the bright versus dark is basically nihilism versus a drive of hope. And it's a big old spectrum. There's some fun tables you can find.
So is there like a classic Noble Bright book that sort of encapsulates that genre?
The most Noble Bright possible is My Little Pony. Not joking. Like it is the absolute example epitome, but like and everybody just agrees on where things sit, because like I've seen Tolkien called Noble Dark, and I don't know that I disagree. It's, if anything, it might be dark, grim bright. But anyway, yeah, we could have a whole discussion on that, and I'm still trying to figure out if there's a third axis. I haven't decided yet.
So going back to tropes and expectation and like Andy breaking the expected, archetypes and stuff. Like I went for a long stretch where I refused to read any fantasy because I didn't want to imitate anyone, and I wanted to do something really unique. And I'm seeing with Heliotrope that some reviewers are saying, oh, this is so unique and different, and it seems like I've been reading the same book over and over, but this is really different. And so that kind of brings you to like how much reading is, people always say, oh, authors need to read. Well, how much reading is too much? Because I find myself when I'm reading and writing at the same time, which I'm always doing, is I tend to almost adopt the voice of whatever book I'm reading, and it scares me a little bit. I'm like, oh, stop that. So I know this is totally off topic. But.
I tend to be pretty conscientious of that too. I try to read other things that I feel aren't going to influence me. I can't read Terry Pratchett while I'm writing, because then my characters start thinking they're hilarious and they're not. But I can read P.G. Wodehouse while I'm editing, and it improves the English of my editing. So I'm conscientious of that, and I went through kind of a detox phase myself too in like 2010 where I stopped reading all fantasy. But because of that, I can look back and say, well, there's a very obvious influence from Pillars of the Earth and Name of the Rose on my Paladins 10 years later, because during that year that I read a ton of stuff in that particular subgenre of fiction, and also read like my first horror, and so there was a lot that came out of that. So I think detoxing that kind of helps you. It's just like growing out of a fanfic stage and looking back at it, realizing, okay, am I detoxed enough that I can write my own stuff?
Yeah, and it brings in other themes and stuff. Like Heliotrope has a little bit of the theme of Pillars of the Earth, with the architecture Pillars of the Earth, and Telio's a stonemason. So I really like that part of Pillars of the Earth. I'm like, oh, the cathedral.
Andy's trying really hard not to smile bigger. He loves. Isn't that your favorite book?
Pillars of the Earth is my favorite. Yeah,
it is. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think there's something to be said for that balance too, because I know when I was first starting and really getting into this first draft of the Bloodstones, I decidedly didn't start my Malazan reread at the same time, because I already know that there are some authors that influence me more than others. And I am still carrying a lot of Erikson influence into my writing, and that's never going to go away because he was a very like influential voice for me at the beginning. But I think partially because I do so much with the booktube sphere and reviewing and all that kind of stuff, I'm able to kind of separate them a little bit easier now. But it definitely depends on which author it is, for sure.
Man, I never realized how lucky I am. Because I never have the problem at all. I can read anything at the same time that I'm writing because I'm lucky. Because as soon as I sit down, it's just me. I write like me. I'll pick up pieces and I'll get like, I love when I find new words. I'm like, oh, I want to use that one. Or one of the great things about reading fantasy and sci-fi is that you come up with concepts and you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. To me, it's all like, what do I want to play with? And I read it for the story, but you're also picking out other things. But like I'm really lucky because it's just me making words on the page, and I never have to worry about style.
I think allowing your characters to grow in your multiple drafts also helps with that. Like, I'll specifically cast somebody as a character in my head. And by that, I'll say, like, I want Jude Law's Watson as this character.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in my head, it will always be Jude Law. Like, that's the picture in my head now. So I can shorthand as I'm writing what's happening. But it will, by the time it gets to print, not be Watson anymore. It's just Jude Law's voice over this character who's grown from that.
It's your guy.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was a couple of comments and questions I wanted to run in. Matt, being able to interact with you all is such a privilege. Hearing about your process, just getting your thoughts on books you're reading makes me want to prioritize indie books on my TBR. Yes. Do it.
We're glad to be interacting with you too, Matt.
Absolutely.
Whether you read our books or not.
And yes. I'll say the other thing, Matt, with indie books, there are 8 billion of them, right? Mm-hmm. And Kindle Unlimited is an amazing tool. And I have gotten to try and discard lots and lots of different indie writers. The thing that I will say, if you want to save yourself some time and get some good bets, listen to Tori or listen to a booktuber that you really like, or find 3 or 4 people that review books and you've read them and they've got the same kind of feel, because everybody likes different stuff. And if you can find a couple of guides to be the first people over the hill, they'll give you 10 recommendations before you can blink, and they'll probably mostly be the right thing for you.
And get on Goodreads too and follow everybody. Not everybody leaves notes as they're reading, but like Elizabeth who's in the chat, she leaves comments even on things that she's going to DNF. Mm-hmm. So she'll get and from that you can get really informed on something where she might DNF something and you're like, that doesn't bother me, I can keep reading, and you may go read that book. Or you might find that you align with different reviewers you read and say, if they tell me I'm not going to like something, I'm probably not going to like something. Yeah. And then that just helps you short down what you're going to be reading off of your TBR. So.
Jen kind of started, but there's a bunch of comments here too about, bringing in younger readers into fantasy, because so many of us have stories of how formative a piece of writing was for us when we were a kid, and it helped shape us into readers. And I think, as we look back and we think about the first fantasy series that we read as younger readers, and how that was kind of the gateway into the bigger genre, and how, I have so many friends who are huge fans of like the Wheel of Time. And one of the main things that they talk about every single time is the reason why it stayed with them for so long is because it was like oftentimes one of the first big fantasy series they read. And it kind of has that nostalgia. That's what got me into this genre that I love too.
Yeah.
And I think because we're oftentimes younger when we jump into that, it is important, to have, like you said, Palmer, we've all been there. We have to have those characters in there that can catch on to those younger readers that are starting to come into the genre and read fantasy sometimes for the first time. And yeah, Lantern had kind of the same idea. The significance of youth in stories cannot be understated. It gives youth the insight that they can choose to live differently in a better way, if at all possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I have fictional role models. I mean, you know, for sure that we go into books and it's like, man, I want to be them someday.
Friar Philip.
Right?
Friar Philip. Maybe you want to be a better man.
Yep.
Let's see. Elizabeth had a really good question. Do you ever write stories with the intent of sharing lessons you've learned as an adult that you would have appreciated hearing as a kid?
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's really, I mean, everybody's going to have a different opinion on this, but that's part of the reason that you approach YA from a storytelling perspective is you don't want to be heavy-handed about it, and you don't want to feel like, you know, I've got all the answers and I'm going to share them with you. Recognizing the answer is less important than the question. Recognizing that those questions are there and those feelings are there, and oh, by the way, those feelings are valid because everybody's comparing up. Everybody's, oh, I should be like this, or I should be like this, and I'm crap because I'm not that. And being able to spend some time with somebody who's in the same boat as you, where they're probably looking up to, and they've got problems that are insurmountable in front of them. And, you know, what does that look like? And then being able to convey some of those things that you've learned, I think is important, even if it's not the thing that you learned. You're just hitting that note, you know, and letting them know, oh, guess what? This is going to be okay. You know, next time you want something really badly, try to want it a little less. There's a little life lesson for you. You know, there's all kinds of things that you can layer in there that help. That's really kind of where it comes from, is because it's not one particular lesson that you're trying to teach. You're just trying to help them climb the stairs a little bit. And it's not, again, not just for kids. It's lost and lonely. What do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? What does it look like? So yeah, I don't think I think it's tough to write YA without putting on your mentor hat a little bit. Yeah. And going, all right, look, kid, here's the way it works.
Palmer?
Well, I mean, you're naturally putting obstacles in front of them and having them explore solutions, right? And if you are a writer who's a little bit older, who's kind of lived through some crap yourself, then you might have some interesting stories that you can tell and show kind of the paths that fail, the paths that succeed. And then you have a couple of different structures. You have the structure where it's only a bunch of young people who they're figuring it out through their trials, right, and failures. Or you have the structure where you've got a mentor figure who's imparting wisdom, right? So those are very different formats, right?
Well, and you can do the one where all of the adults are bad, right? It's basically, you know, Hunger Games, where it's like everybody in charge is evil. How else do you want to put it? And then part of what you're passing along is, what do you do with that, right? What do you do with a world where none of it is for you? And
that's where the metaphor is made manifest, right? Is that all adults are evil? How it's not in the end how the adults are even defeated. It's how Katniss reacts to her own circumstance.
Yep.
Right? So.
And it also can help some young people or people in general who feel really stuck in a situation.
Yeah.
That maybe you don't have to stay in that situation.
Yeah.
And maybe the people who are oppressing you really are bad, and you know, you don't have to accept it, or you don't have to try to make it be okay, or you don't have to try to fix them. You either fight them or get the hell out of there. You know?
Yeah. And sometimes that's all you need to do. It's not necessarily any one particular object lesson. It's that Prior Philip making you want to be a better man. It's giving you the hope that you can change things, that you can make choices that are yours, that you can grab the reins on this horse and make it go the way you want it to go. And it doesn't have to be any one particular thing, but that kind of, it's drawn courage from somebody else's experience saying, okay, I can do that too.
And you also, fantasy allows you to show the protagonist as a hero, to basically exceed what a normal person would generally be able to accomplish or experience. And it gives you that vicarious, like, yeah.
Yep.
Because in the real world, you can't be a hero when you're 14.
Come on, you can be an Olympic athlete.
Yeah, but probably not anyone that's reading.
They don't have time for this.
They gotta be working out a lot.
I think for the lessons too, as an author, it's also about an opportunity for us to work through it ourselves, and and from both sides, right? Like we may have something that we believe, and then we can put that in the book. But if you just put it out there, all you're doing is soapboxing. Versus you can say, okay, here's the premise I'm going with, and then if we do our job right, that we then steel man the argument and set up both sides so that we can make a better argument. Even in the end, it's a fictionalized version of how you're going to present things because you're the author. But we do have the opportunity to analyze both sides and through that possibly even reinform ourselves or remind ourselves why we believe something.
Right, and try to figure it out ourselves as we write it. Right. And then you get the fun thing where the character kind of writes a new path that you hadn't thought of,
That's the best part. I'm sorry, but when they figure it, you're like, aha, I've got you now. And they're like, nope. You're like, whoa. I love it when that stuff happens.
Yeah, that's when you get into that zone of that, like almost subconscious creativity zone where these solutions come out of nowhere or the characters go off in some. You're like, wait a second, I didn't plan. That wasn't in my house. Where did you come from?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
And I think that's why having the spectrum of levels of content and theme is important because as a kid who maybe you get to 16 and you've seen a lot more things in life than the average 16-year-old and you don't relate to the really let's go grab a sword and fight a dragon because you know what that looks like in real life, right? And that was one of the reasons for me with Phased where I really wanted to lean into you can go through really, really hard, dark things and come out the other side and still have spirit left, and still have that desire to do more and be your own person and fight back. And I think the spectrum is so important. And it's why I think the lines get so blurred so often is because we all have a different level of experience and boundary and a desire of what we want out of our reading experience. So we kind of, touched on this a little bit. We were talking about boundaries, but are there any boundaries that you guys personally set for yourselves when you are writing younger characters?
I don't kill kids or dogs.
All right, everybody in the chat, if you kids and dogs are safe.
I kind of model a lot of my writing on what really happens in the real world. And I'm like, well, would this happen? Does this happen? Could it happen? Has it happened to people? And then if I want to go there, if I want to go into maybe dark places, then it has to be for a reason, right? I don't like gratuitous, sensationalist kind of stuff for the sake of it. But going to George R. R. Martin again, he said his method is to take history and then to dial it up to 11. So to take real events and then to just amplify them. And, you could say that happens as well in fiction where, this is real life and then some. But there's boundaries. Pedophilia kind of stuff. Although you look at what's going on with the George R. R. Martin stuff, you're like, he's going I don't know. Where are the boundaries? I don't know. I think that if you're portraying dark stuff as dark and against societal norms and dangerous and damaging, as opposed to glorifying it, then to me, that's a boundary. If there's something that's inappropriate and is horrible, then frame it that way and hopefully bring justice at the end, right? As opposed to like kind of encouraging it or writing it for people to like
shock value,
get off on the dark stuff. Like that I don't want to write that.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't want to shy away from the realities because, I mean, a lot of people have gone through a lot of bad stuff in life, and people you just know in your life you've walked around with, you wouldn't know, right? But there's a lot of like unpleasant stuff that people go through that, and a lot of times it's not in our society, it's not okay to talk about it in general. It's not like, at a barbecue, you're going to start talking about, some horrible thing that happened to you, right? It's not socially really acceptable. So it could be an outlet for people to kind of to relate, have something they can relate to. Like, yeah, I went through some bad stuff too, and I was only 16, and let's see how this person who got attacked by, a monster, how did they get out of it? Right. Because, maybe this person in my life is like a monster to me. How would I fight back? How would I want to fight back?
Andy?
I mean, from a mechanical perspective, I nix the bad language. I get one S word per book, and that's it. And with their levels of bad words, I tell you, I'm allowed to go to level 2, but I'm not allowed to go to level 3.
Right.
But the one that I try to focus on is not pretending that when I was 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, that there wasn't all kinds of bad stuff that I was reading in books and playing in video games and were part of the stories that I really enjoyed, right? Whatever, take Indiana Jones as an example. You got, some threat of torture going on in there. You got some dark stuff going on across the board. Trying to pretend like teenagers don't know what dark is stupid. And it's just a waste of everybody's time. So I am more than comfortable putting dark in there with the boundary of, hey, this is meant for a 13-year-old should be able to pick this up and be okay. That doesn't mean that there's not damaging stuff in there. There should be. And I think a lot of people that kind of wonder about YA authors, none of it, I don't think any of us is sitting here thinking that our audience is a bunch of little fragile glass figures that are going to break. And we don't do kid gloves, and we're going to hold up the mirror to life, as it were, and pretending, it's all flowers and roses until you're 16 years old. It's just a waste of everybody's time. So I intentionally don't put boundaries on where it's going to go, because I can take you somewhere really dark without damaging your soul. And I think some of that's important to dig into some of those rabbit holes, because that's part of what the questioning is. Right. So if we wind up in a dark place, if the story winds up in a dark place, I'm just going to go ahead and go there, because that's what the story needs.
Yeah. Kind of a question to go back to the design process of when we're first coming up with these stories and starting to bring the characters to life. How do you go about character design, and do you design younger characters differently than your adult characters, and how so? Is the process different at all for younger characters? That would be my answer.
No words.
I went with the JCM method before I knew him, and that was write against what I hated. So like seeing unrealistic little kids, I wrote a little kid who was like my own son at the time, because he was 4, and I was like, and early reviews were like, well, it's not like a real kid. It's like, you've met the wrong kids, I think. And so I try to write except when I'm intentionally leaning into a trope. And even then, I want to write something that says, you know what, it's been done wrong all this time, in my opinion. And then that's obviously not true. But you know, when you think back to all the poorly written kids, you're like, they're not all badly written, they're not all poorly written, but you know, there's a couple that are sitting in your head, even if you can't name them, that are the badly written kids, and those are the ones that you don't want to emulate. So how can you do it in a way that is not like that? So
right. Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on this right now, Andrew, but I totally agree, Lantern, that I think a lot of people find intelligent children in stories unbelievable, which I find really unbelievable because
as an intelligent child,
I mean, like, as a mom of 3 children, like, my kids totally blow my mind with some of the stuff they come up with and understand. And it's like, you know, it is okay to have a variety of kids who've experienced different things and are at different levels, even when they're at the same age, because that's life, right? You know, there's the kid who you're afraid when they walk to the mailbox by themselves, and then there's the other kid that you would trust to run a shop by themselves at like age 10. You know, like there's so many different there's such a broad variety, and I think people tend to box young characters in too much to what
I think we forget how nuanced we were as kids.
Right.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Because if you can't tap into that stuff, what good are you? Because I mean, that's the story that you're telling. And if you pretend like you were some
one note
cardboard version cutout of a kid that wasn't filled with complex nuances and weird picadillos and strange things that you thought, you know, it doesn't work for anybody. Nobody is that person.
Right.
Do you think that's because we as kids boxed our own friends in? Like we're obviously the most complex person we ever know, right? Because nobody's ever experienced it.
Nobody knows me.
Right. But did we I wonder if we compartmentalized our own kids, our own friends in our own friend zone, as you know, that's the sword friend. I'm gonna go play swords with him. But that's what we did. And this is the kid that you went over, and his big brother brought a big bag of discarded tags from the bar. Like, we were going through and finding prizes. This is fun. Then we threw them all away because it was all fake. That's the kid that had the tags, right? And so I wonder if we compartmentalized from an early age on, and so then when we look back at kids, we never think of ourselves, and we just assume all the other kids were as two-dimensional as we thought they were. I don't know.
I find myself falling into a trap of being the lazy writer. So first of all, I would say that when writing a true good character, I'm just writing an individual in their arc, and it doesn't matter what age they are. A younger human has as much of a personality and wit and intelligence, maybe not the same experience, but as many adults. So, but I do find myself, particularly in first drafts, often writing, and this is horrible, writing kids and writing females as passive, and having the active characters be male. And I'll find myself doing that, and I'm like, what am I doing? And I've taken feminist studies and and university, I should know better, right? But no, here I am falling into these society stereotypes as a writer, and then I have to go clean that up on a later draft. So I would say that boxing, go back to what you're saying, Andrew, boxing my friends boxing characters into kind of superficial, takeaways of who they are. I think sometimes if, we relate to other people like that. For myself, I find that I was just taking shortcuts, and I was just writing the first draft really fast. To go flesh out that character and think about who is this character actually.
Yeah.
I just got to raise my hand for bookishly bookish. Younger humans many times have more personality than adults, and I could not agree with you more. Raw nerves. That's what makes young adult characters fun, is because they're constantly agitated about everything. Because they don't have any calluses.
Well, they
Right?
haven't built
They
up
don't
the
have a lot of-
system of filters yet
Yeah.
either, right?
There's no filters, there's no
Yeah.
calluses. It's just raw nerve all the way through. And there's something enjoyable about writing that character because we all kind of wish we could be a raw nerve. And being able to play with that aspect of it is great. Besides, your emotions go bam. I mean, every emotional hit when you're a kid is massive. It's like getting smacked with the Titanic, you know?
I have a feeling, Andy, you are still a kid from the
Yeah. I'm honestly convinced that everybody is about 12.
I mean,
I say to all my friends, the only difference between us and the playground is that we have more tools with which to be vindictive. As adults.
Ooh.
Kids are vindictive too, but it's because we have all never left the playground. I'm still the kid playing turtles on the wasp-infested wooden playground, not playing football. And the football kid is still watching football every Sunday. So we never leave the playground. We're still petty as all heck. And we just have more tools with which to be petty.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to just compartmentalize everybody. Just know that it's much easier to handle a job when you can say that's the cheerleader, right? No.
But it's funny because we do that. I mean, when we meet people, it is really difficult to not kind of, even if you're trying not being judgmental, but you just kind of categorize immediately, like based on how they're talking. You're like, okay, you're in this box, and now I know how to talk to you, right? Yeah.
And the good friends are the ones that subvert that trope at you.
Yes.
You assumed they were one thing, and as soon as you discover the next layer of the onion, you're like, oh, you're a real person like me, because after all, I'm the only person in the universe, right?
Yeah.
But that's we're doing
right.
this, and as soon as those feathers come off, we start making friends.
Yeah.
So what do you think about young protagonists who have like special powers, or they're descended from royalty, or they're whatever, they know magic, right? It seems like that happens a lot with younger protagonists in fantasy, because those are tropes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think those are overused, or do you like them?
I did it.
I'm
doing it again right now.
There you go.
I'm doing it.
Andy, are you're breaking this trope?
Well, no magical powers for my main character or my secondary character, but the
not from the point of view of the other characters, though.
From
Not
the point of view of the other characters,
though.
He's got special powers. But the I feel like it's whatever serves the story, right? You can do a young adult character who's Superman, and you can make something amazing, and you can make something awful, right? The particulars, don't necessarily matter all that much to me. What I care about is whether I'm in their skin. And if I can relate to them, or I can feel what they're feeling, or I can identify with them in some way, you can have a laser sword. Sure, go nuts.
I think it's also a matter of how one note are you avoiding them becoming, right? Do they become a well realized Clark Kent, or do they become Homelander? That's two very different stories from the same character, right?
And both of those would be interesting,
right? And whereas if it's just the boy in blue, what does he do? Well, he has laser eyes. Well, what does he do? I don't know.
He has laser eyes.
Have you done him justice? So
well, and keep in mind, we're talking about sci-fi fantasy.
Yeah.
So some kind of odd quirk that makes them different is probably needs to be in there somewhere. And because you can run a threat of, I've got a completely mundane character walking through here. What am I going to do with her? And so special abilities kind of help, because everybody is unique, and everybody has a unique set of skills. And I think part of it is figuring out, what do I do with the laser sword? Well, I can fly now. What am I supposed to do with that? And kind of figuring out that journey. And I think the rest of it is just, pieces you tack onto the how you paint the character, so you can go, okay, well, I want to tell this type of story where my main character can fly, and what does that need to happen?
Well, I think too, like we talked about the metaphor made manifest earlier, and I think, you know, every single kid, and I was like this when you're a kid, we're different than all the other kids,
Yes.
right? In our own head, we're very
Yes.
different. And so in fantasy, we're allowed to kind of play with that on a very visual level, essentially, where this kid is different because they have royal blood, or this kid is different because they are really good at this specific type of magic. And it just kind of, it's literally what most kids feel like, that they're somehow outside, or they're somehow, you know,
different.
superior.
I wish I had that.
You know, I wish I had that, or I know I have this, how come nobody else does? That kind of, you know, either one of those mindsets. And I think there was a comment up here that Lantern had again too, that I totally agree with. And I fell into this trap a little bit at the beginning of my current work in progress, where I wasn't giving my young main character enough of a layered approach that I needed. I went back in and I said, okay, just because he is 11-ish at the beginning of the story doesn't mean he hasn't already had this arc and have these wounds inside and have these things that I can build on and take him through the rest of the story. And that's, I think people, again, they kind of dumb down, well, the kid characters are just, they're just kids. They don't have anything interesting to add to the story, when in fact that couldn't be further from the truth.
And then Stranger Things comes out.
How would you answer that question, Palmer?
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kids, remember when you were 10, you had, I mean, I had lived a whole huge life. I mean, then 10 years was this eternity, right? And all the dramas they went on with my siblings and my parents, and everything around me was very vibrant and very huge and almost primal. I mean, remember, I mean, I don't know about you, but I used to, like, my brother used to beat the heck out of me. Like, you know, beating with his fists, you know.
Yep.
Maybe I hope he's not watching this. But, you know, like,
shout out.
Kids are primal animals, you know, violent, like fighting, like schoolyard fights. Those were a big thing, like, and bad, and bullying. And this kid used to go around with a bullwhip and terrorize everyone. I mean, this was like a huge world. So as an adult, I think we forget about a lot of those, like, nuances of that they're fully realized human beings, even when they're like pre-verbal, when they're like still don't speak English very well, you know, they're 2 or 3, that's, you know, they've got huge lives that they're dealing with. And I used to teach in the inner city, and I mean, these kids are like 4 years old and watching their parents shoot each other, you know. I mean, there's huge trauma that you can experience as, you know, as a young person that will impact you for the rest of your life, and that you need to work through, right? Hopefully deal with. And there's definitely archetypes going back to these archetypes. For Heliotrope, I specifically figured I consciously chose the themes before I started, and I thought, okay, well, what book was really impactful to me emotionally, and it was Assassin's Apprentice, the whole first trilogy of Robin Hobb. And why was that so impactful to me? So I sort of, you know, just sort of like did reverse engineering to figure out what was it about those books that struck me emotionally so hard. And I came to the conclusion that it was, you know, Fitz being a bastard, but he really was the son, but he wasn't being acknowledged for it. And so there was this, you know, not being acknowledged for what you're due, kind of being, you know, beat up figuratively or real for that, and sort of the unfairness of it, and the tribal unfairness of not being acknowledged for your skills, and then the whole lineage tribal thing. Like, these are just very, very human stuff that, you know, tribalism is just so strong in us that, so I pulled on those heartstrings, and I modeled a couple of the characters have very similar things to that. And I did it on purpose because I said, okay, these resonate with everyone because we're primal tribal beings. And this is going to be emotional for people. So I'm going to write it that way.
Yeah.
That was a very long, rambling answer.
That's okay. This is a very informal, relaxed writer's room where we can ramble about whatever topic we choose. It's great.
Great. I'm going to go take care of my son for the 4th time.
Okay, no worries. Joanna wanted to know, is there a different standard for young and male protagonists with special powers? People often criticize not like other girls in YA. Just curious. I mean, I feel like there's kind of a flip side of that too, Joanna, where, you know, I hear people complain about the farm boy with a sword just as much, I think. And I, from my perspective, I feel like this is really, people are just writing the characters now. And I feel like that's more and more the case in fantasy, where you can have, you know, any version of the archetype on either gender of character, and it's people are writing about it, which is fun to see. But yeah, Palmer, do you have a?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a lot of girls in real life who are not like the other girls, you know, the tomboys or whatever, who
Hi.
yeah. So, you know, you've got your kind of stereotypical, you know, meet whatever society defines as appropriately female for that age or whatever, for that culture. And then you have those in both males and females who don't fit strictly into those definitions and are the other ones, are strange or weird or rebels, or, you know, get in trouble a lot, or other kids make fun of them or whatever. And those tend to be the more interesting characters. So, you know, I think they tend to be more interesting to write about, because if there's nothing unique, different, or challenging happening, it's not really a story, right? Not fiction. It's not an interesting book, right? So if we're just to do slice of life all the way through, and there's no conflict and there's no, you know, deviation from the norm, then it's a memoir maybe, but it's not fiction.
Yeah.
I think it's a challenge for us too as authors. Not that we need to be like put a stamp on it, but having a character like I'm not like other girls. So prove it. And I'm not saying prove it that's the only way to validate the character, but like we always have an opportunity whenever a trope comes along to say, okay, but I can either avoid the trope entirely and probably fall into it anyway, or I can lean into it and make that and you know, kind of put my flag down. When I say she's not like other girls, when I say he's a farm boy, gosh darn, he's going to be a great farmer before he leaves that farm, or something else, or he's just the worst farmer. People are like, would you please leave? Please, we're done. This is it. You know, so we have opportunities to flip almost anything we do. And so maybe that's a challenge. If there's lots of, I guess the question really comes down to is the not the other girls trope a trope because a lot of them are just like other girls. So prove your readers otherwise. I think Wednesday Addams is another great example of that. They did kind of lean in towards that. That's kind of the funny. That's what's funny about that show. I'm not like other girls, but she really is.
It's true.
She's going through a lot of the same problems that all the other girls are, but she doesn't think so. So that's her marriage of her two halves is realizing that. Is that I am like others in that I am unique because I am above because I can see it now from above it, and that provides a huge pedestal for all of us to stand on. As we can start to see ourselves in the third person, we can better realize who we are, and that does make us not like other. Doesn't make me like not like other girls. Is realizing who I am as a person.
I think there's also diving into how the girls are the same, because you have a lot of tropes in fantasy where the females are very powerful as a group, right? When I was young, when I was a child, I used to love the witch books, you know, and you'd have these covens of witches, and, you know, you have all the, you know, the Eye of the World, the Robert Jordan series with the White Tower, right? And you've got a lot of these sisterhoods who are extremely powerful and have very strong magic. And so those show the power of women in numbers. And then the same thing with, you know, wizards and soldiers and, you know.
Like look at Han Solo. It's in his name. He's solo. He does his own thing, but he is literally nothing without the people around him. He's a pretty worthless character, except when he's in a group. Because when he's in a group, that's what makes him the perfect scoundrel. Is that he knows where his weaknesses are and he shores up other people's weaknesses. And so in the end, it's all a farce. He's not a solo. He's not a scoundrel. He's the friend everybody wants to have piloting their ship. If only to be the fall guy for the problems, right? Because it's not his fault. But
he's not like other girls.
No, I'm not like other scoundrels.
Right? Yeah.
Well, and I just want to say that Joanna said something earlier that she kept a journal from when she was a kid.
Yes.
So that she didn't forget what that was like. And I think that's an incredibly useful tool for telling stories about younger people, is because you realize exactly how vibrant all of that was and how immediate everything was. And not letting that get away is important. And it continues to be important, like recognizing what your 20s look like and what they actually were and what your 30s look like and what they actually are. You know, you tend to gloss over a lot of the past. It's all worked out. It was fine. No, it wasn't.
We romanticize it too in a lot of ways. And like, you know, I see this all the time when, you know, as a young mom, when you first have your newborn child, and it's this society has romanticized this experience to such an extent, and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And it is.
Also,
it's a mess. And all of the things that people never prepare you for when you are at home and you are like, you know, sitting in your chair and you smell like sour milk and you all these things. And it's just, you haven't done laundry because you walking around is not comfortable. Like, I mean, it's just
in a couple days.
And yet every older mom, what do you always hear? You'll love every moment. You'll love every moment. You just enjoy. And it's like, yes, but also
I've been strapped to a puking bologna loaf for the last 3 days.
Right. So, and like you can have, and that's where, you know, a wonderful therapist I worked with a few years ago had a wonderful quote that I have never forgotten that totally blew my mind. It's one of those things that therapists do where they tell you something really simple and you're like, you know. And she was like, 2 things can be true at the same time. And I remember just having a moment with that and realizing that, yes, I can have this moment where this beautiful, tiny sleeping human is snuggled up with me. And it is the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. And also, you know, I'm not going to miss diapers. I'm sorry. I'm just not. That's not a moment that I'm going to enjoy forever. So like having that, I think 2 things can be true at the same time is too often we want to like, it's only good or it's only bad. And we don't ever marry the 2.
And that reminds me of something that's really beautiful about young people, in that they are so resilient. They can have such hard things going on in their life, but they can be so like hopeful and optimistic and kind of pure and clear, you know. I think as we get older, maybe we lock in the jadedness a little bit. But I mean, I've seen some amazing young people who are going through really bad traumas, and some of the other work that I did with like juvenile delinquent types who the problem was not them, it was their parents. I'm sorry. Most of their parents were completely terrible nuts, but the kids were going through such gnarly stuff, such bad stuff. And yet they had it together. They were just, you know, had such clarity. And so, yeah, 2 things can be true at the same time. You can be suffering and you can be hopeful at the same time. Young protagonists give you, as a writer, the freedom to have both be true at the same time.
Yeah. Children have that naturally, the curious and vibrant, because they literally can't not have it. They're a reminder. Yeah. It's a way of keeping that both at the same time. Yeah. Well, I mean, guys, we've been talking for 1 hour and 45 minutes, which is incredible. And this is a topic that I feel like we could have multiple episodes on because, but I love getting a chance to kind of dive into this because I do think that young protagonists in fantasy is such an important topic to talk about. yeah, and I'm really glad because we touched on way more topics than I even thought we were going to, which is awesome. So first of all, I want to say thank you to all three of you for coming on and sharing your time and chatting with me on imposter syndrome. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you for having us all.
I
got to learn some things.
Yeah, me too. Oh gosh. And it's helping even for me. Like I love these so much because I'm writing young protagonists right now. And I just, it's making me think through it in a different way. And it's rekindling my excitement about diving back into these characters and really seeing, you know, how much more can I do with them and how can I approach it in a different way. So I appreciate all you guys. I'm learning a lot at the same time. So for anybody in the chat, I have down in the description below, I have websites to all three of these wonderful authors, and you should definitely go and pick up their books if you have not already. I think, yeah, I have websites down, and all of you guys have links to all of your books on your websites. So everybody can go and find the right fit to add to their...
send you a signed one.
Right, there you go. So yeah, thank you guys in the chat so much for hanging out with us and for your wonderful questions. I always love that we have this option for interactive during the live streams because it just adds a lot to the discussion. So thanks, guys. And yeah, we will see you guys in the next episode. Bye, everybody.
Tori. Thanks, Anne.